This video is about the second part of the lesson about the cultural upheavals that took place in Europe during the early modern times. It will be specifically about the artistic movement that spread across the continent and which has been remembered as the Renaissance. And what we'll examine in this lesson is how the Renaissance proved to be a moment of redefinition of art in general and even a redefinition of beauty. In this first video, which is about part A, we'll examine the new environment in which artists could work and how it favored their creation. So first of all, a few words about the economic and political context, which mattered a lot. Indeed, this period, so we talk about the 15th and the 16th centuries in Europe, were clearly 2 centuries of economic growth across the continent. The reason for this growth of the economy was in particular that economies of Europe were being rebuilt after the previous century, which had seen the spreading of a terrible epidemic of plague all across the continent that killed more than 1/3 of the population. So things were clearly getting better in the 15th and 16th century, and it was a moment where international trade in Europe was also growing, and this trade between the different regions of Europe permitted more intense cultural exchanges. Regions where wealth and prosperity were particularly concentrated became the powerhouses of the Renaissance of art. I'm speaking about regions like Flanders, so in the north of Western Europe, and also another very important powerhouse of the artistic Renaissance was the north of Italy. Both regions were very urban and so very marked by an intense trade and also the beginning of a certain industrialization in a way. We can remember as well Western Germany, and the region of the north of France, in particular Paris and the Loire Valley, where the artistic activity of the King of France was particularly intense. Another thing that helped at that moment in Europe was the combination of some technological innovations that helped the artist. I will only take the example of painting, where new techniques and new material permitted an easier making and a better conservation of paintings. The new technique was the oil painting, and the new material was the use of canvas that replaced the traditional base of the painting of the artist, which used to be a fresco technique, very difficult. So oil painting changed a lot of things. Something else that changed was the intense patronage that was made by some rich and powerful people. By patronage, we talk about the financial support which is given to the artist, and this practice, that we could also call sponsoring, became a more widely spread practice. Powerful and rich political actors massively helped artists to create during the Renaissance. These actors were religious actors. This was rather traditional, like the Pope or some rich abbots or bishops that commanded artworks, but also civilian actors, kings, princes, or even newly rich bourgeois people living in prosperous cities. And these actors, in particular the princes, they use arts as a means of communication, or we could also say of propaganda, because they believed artworks would increase their prestige and their visibility. And so one thing that fueled artistic production in the Renaissance was the political rivalries that existed. The good example here is the north of Italy, because the north of Italy was a region that was greatly divided into many small rich microstates, like the Republic of Venice, the Republic of Florence, or the Duchy of Milan, And all these political leaders were in a kind of race for power and prestige, and so they used the artist a lot. One example is Lorenzo de' Medici, who was a very wealthy nobleman whose family was at the head of the Republic of Florence. And you can see him, he was a very, very intense patron. You can see him here painted by Botticelli, or here a sculpture of a bust of the prince by Verrocchio. So consequently, many heads of state were huge sponsors of artistic creation. One example of an artist that was largely employed by different political leaders was Leonardo da Vinci. Just one remark about the head of Leonardo da Vinci. What a famous head, with this long white beard. It's remarkable to see how much Leonardo has become a symbolic character, symbolic of intelligence, symbolic of knowledge and creation. I'm pretty sure you've already seen Leonardo like this, okay, in a famous cartoon. And in fact, he's a character that can also be seen in some video games. This one is a bit old maybe, but it's in Assassin's Creed #2 that you could see young Leonardo da Vinci being a character of the game actually. So I take the example of Leonardo because this artist, who was also a scientist and an engineer, he worked for many different heads of state. Ludovic Sforza, the Duke of Milan, Isabel of Este, who was the Marchioness of Mantua and begged Leonardo for having a portrait of her made by him. As you can see, the portrait was never completely finished. And famously, King Francis I, the King of France, who employed Leonardo at the end of his life. That's the reason why Leonardo died in France. That's the reason why we have so many paintings of him in the Louvre today. But Leonardo was also employed by religious institutions. For example, his famous painting, The Last Supper. That's a good example of a fresco. Okay, it was painted on a wall. It was actually commissioned by a convent in Milan, a very rich convent in Milan, for their restaurant room. And lastly, Leonardo was also employed by rich bourgeois people, like Francesco del Giocondo. He was a rich Italian, and he commissioned a portrait of his wife. As you know, this painting stayed in France when Leonardo died. The second point I'd like to examine in this video is the fact that the status of the artist in European Renaissance changed completely compared to the Middle Ages. I'm pretty sure very few of you could name an artist of the Middle Ages. Can you? You can't, and neither can I actually, at least not a sculptor or a painter, because in those old days artists were almost considered like, you know, any other artisan, or we could also say craftsman in English. I mean, their signature and personal style was not seen as something important. They had to respect very, very precise commands, a bit like we ask today, a plumber for a very specific kind of job to be done in a house. So artists were a bit like this in the Middle Ages. And everything changed in the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, artists began to be recognized, praised, and very largely demanded, not only for their skills, but also for their personal style, and to a certain extent only for the signature at one point. A good example is Michelangelo. Michelangelo, well, I could have chosen Leonardo or Donatello or Raphael, that's true, but Michelangelo was probably in those days, in Italian Renaissance period, the most famous and prestigious artist. He was largely employed in Rome in particular. where not a good start here. It's an example of a statue, very famous statue, probably the most famous of the Renaissance, made by Michelangelo, that was in Florence. So it's David, a biblical figure. In St. Peter's Basilica, which was the new cathedral of Rome, commissioned by the Pope, you can see this extremely famous Pietà, which represents Jesus which is mourned by the woman. But Michelangelo was also an architect. He's responsible for the Dome of St. Peter's Basilica, still in Rome, in Vatican today. And in the palace of the Pope in Vatican, Michelangelo was extremely famously employed for painting the wall of the Sistine Chapel, which was a kind of personal chapel of the Pope. And he made this incredible Last Judgment, as you can see, with this specific style of very strong bodies with huge muscles, almost like some kind of superheroes. And that represents the famous biblical scene of the Last Judgment, with the elect people on the left that would go to heaven, and on the right those that will go to hell. Look at this incredible level of detail that sometimes can be very, very surprising, like this one. In the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo also painted the ceiling, with many scenes as well taken from the Bible, from the Old Testament. Here, this painting, yes, at the center of the ceiling, representing Adam and God, is maybe one of the most famous paintings ever. So that was an example of how famous an artist could become in the Renaissance. Now, even though artists still had their workshop and employed many people, notably many apprentices, they started to develop a very personal style, the best of them. And they even started to introduce some self-portraits in their painting. Take the example of this famous painting by Botticelli, The Adoration of the Magi. It's again a biblical scene where young baby Jesus is being presented to the three kings. Well, maybe you recognize on the left Lorenzo de' Medici, who commissioned the painting, but actually on the other side of the painting, on the right, is Botticelli himself. So that's a self-portrait, and that's rather new. Okay, I'd like to take another example from the other side of Europe, from Flanders, Jan van Eyck, who painted as much at the end of the Middle Ages, at the beginning of the Renaissance. But look at how modern is this painting. It's a painting of a bourgeois couple, very rich man with his wife. He's neither a king or a priest or anything, but he considers himself to be very, very important, and so he asks for a portrait by Van Eyck. It's full of detail, and Van Eyck was some kind of a joker, painted himself in the painting. And where is Van Eyck? Well, you can't find Van Eyck. Actually, he's right at the center of the painting. Try again. Okay, so here is the solution. Van Eyck is actually painted inside the mirror at the back of the room, and so you can see the entire view of the room, but seen from behind. And so the man in blue is actually painting the portrait, and that's Van Eyck painting himself. He even signed above the mirror, and he wrote something like Van Eyck was here. And last but not least, just to show how artists became aware of their own importance, they started to paint self-portraits. That is to say that they became the subject of their painting. The most famous of them was Dürer, a German painter, who made many self-portraits of himself, at different ages. And so clearly we can see how much Renaissance was really the moment when the individuality of the people began to matter in society and in culture.